Bagalevsi Ilukavsi, welcome to Climate Force Displacement, Decolonizing Research. Thank you for your patience as we were sorting out technological issues. I'd like to introduce a dear friend and mentor of mine to open up our session today. Patricia Cochran is also Inupiaq from my home region, and she was born and raised in Nome, Alaska, and she serves as the executive director of the Alaska Native Science Commission. And Patricia will say more about herself after her introduction, but it's my honor to hand it over to Patricia.
Diana, thank you very much, Anouk. I really appreciate everybody's patience in getting us all started. Let me begin our session by starting in the appropriate way for all of us in Indigenous communities, which is to first give thanks to the Creator for this beautiful day that has been given to us, by honoring all of our elders who are still with us and remembering all of our ancestors who have come before us. I want to have each and everyone who's on the call with us today stop for just a moment and pay respect to the people whose Indigenous lands we are on today. For myself, I'm in Anchorage, Alaska, on the lands of the Dena'ina people. And I ask each of you to remember the Indigenous communities whose lands you are upon today. I'll start right into my presentation. I know we're running a little bit late over all of this, so let me just first of all introduce a little bit more about myself. I am director of the Alaska Native Science Commission, a commission that was established here in Alaska in 1994. Next slide, please. So let me tell you a little bit about myself. My background is I was born and raised in Nome. My people come from King Island and from Wales. You can see both of those communities listed, or you can see them on your screen. I want you to take special note of the picture on the right, because this is the reason that I'm so passionate about the work that I do, and I've been doing climate science for more than 40 years here in the Arctic. Sorry about that, my phone wasn't turned off, but it is now. So the photo on the right is my hometown in Nome, and that picture is, again, one of the reasons why I'm very passionate about the work that I do. This is at my brother's home. So you can see the issues that we're having throughout Alaska and the kinds of problems that we're seeing throughout the Arctic. Next slide. I'm going to talk about a number of issues today, but honestly, I want to leave most of the time for the younger people who are going to speak after me. As I said, I've been doing this for a very long time, and I'm so happy now to see so many of our young leaders step forward and be the leaders in our dialogue throughout all the nations. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about all of these issues, including erosion, permafrost, sea ice, storms, glaciers, fires, temperatures, invasive species, food security, and open Arctic waters. All of these are huge issues. I did put on the screen a YouTube presentation that I did that'll give you a much longer version of what I'm talking about today. Next session, please. Next slide. I always like to start with this particular slide that actually came from one of my mentors, from Oscar Kalagli, a Yupik elder here. I love this slide because it really tells so much about our culture and history and about what people don't know about our communities. You can see the tip of the iceberg, which is what people see, our surface culture. They know about our arts, our storytelling, our dance and drums, those kinds of things, but have no concept of the thousands of years that came before that, of people understanding and being able to, for instance, navigate oceans because of their extreme, unbelievable knowledge of different observational skills of looking at the skies and understanding what was going on in constellations and stars, where the kayak came from. You know, these are the kinds of technologies that our communities have known about and worked in for thousands and thousands of years. Next slide, please. These are some of the things I want to discuss today. How our native ways of knowing, how that's important and how they absolutely contribute to understanding the ecosystem, the world that we all live in today, because we can offer understanding of how cultures are sustained in extreme climates and in changing climates, how we access subsistence foods, where, how and when and where, our weather patterns that we see daily and have been able to observe over centuries of time, our sustainable food techniques and strategies, changes in wildlife and biology and behavior patterns, because we're so closely tied to the earth, Mother Earth, and see the subtlest of changes long before everybody else does. How to adapt to climatic changes, our complex natural interrelationships, abnormal phenomena over long periods of time, and a qualitative historical knowledge of the natural world. Next slide. These are some of the reasons, or the benefits and products that come from the knowledge that comes from our communities. We actually can help determine if the anomalies are local, if they're regional, if they're ecosystem-wide. This is the kind of knowledge that really is needed in science to be able to understand it in a more fruitful and helpful fashion. We can help to identify emergent trends at their very outset, again, because we're the first ones seeing them. We can assist in developing hypotheses for marine species through our local observation skills. We become active partners and participants, ensuring more and better science going on within all of our communities. We're able to provide ground truthing to scientific data gathering. Researchers and students increase their own observational skills. It also brings contact with the local elders and communities. We help bring to the table processes and protocols that can be replicated in other communities, especially in other Indigenous communities, but that are helpful to research across the board. And mostly that organizations really do become more active participants and become more active in conferences, et cetera. These are just a few of the benefits and products that we can see that come from the inclusion of traditional ways of knowing. Next slide, please. Why the need for participatory research? These are some of the questions that I've asked myself over the many years that I've been doing this. Why has so much research produced so few solutions? You know, one of the reasons we understand is because not always the right questions are asked and people don't know how to ask those questions. So these are some of the reasons we need to have participatory research. Why are we asking the same questions as we did 40 or 50 years ago? I hate to say it, but these are many of the same issues that I started my journey in science and research 40 or 50 years ago. We know of the history of the violations of trust. We know that our Indigenous ways of knowing are marginalized. And there's a great quote here from my friend Linda Smith. I know we'll talk about this more as we get further on. Next slide, please. These are some of the challenges to the use and application of traditional knowledge that the scientific community and policymakers usually marginalize our information and call it anecdotal. I'll tell you truthfully that being called anecdotal is one of the reasons that I really got into science, because I was so tired of seeing that word used for all of the information that comes from our communities. It's not anecdotal information when it has centuries of information behind it. That Alaska Natives can serve as advisors, but rarely act as research partners or real collaborators, except to provide information in Western scientific frameworks. There are no policy level directives or consistent financial support for the use and application of traditional knowledge. This is one of the things that I have seen throughout all of my career. There has to be a better way of doing this. There has to be a way that we can change things so that there's funding available and that directives do not change with every administration. that little is known or understood on how to communicate and exchange information between scientists and elders. We're doing better at that, and that's because of the kinds of programs that we've instituted. Scientists and researchers have little or no grounding for training, but we are again helping scientists to understand better ways of working within our communities. And of course, there's that history of distrust and concern that research is too limited and will be used against the communities. That's one of the reasons for having partnerships. Next slide, please. So these are some of my conclusions and recommendations that academic researchers and institutions have to relinquish or share their roles as PIs to become and accept community direction and priorities and understand who disseminates and who owns the findings that comes from research. That research funders must require and support participatory research. I've written many articles about it that give you ways of understanding and working within participatory research. There are many of our Native scientists who have that information out and available. Researchers in Indigenous communities need to look for global models. We need to understand, research funders need to understand valid ways of knowing and not just Western ways of knowing. Participatory research involves capacity building and funding at the local level. That participatory research includes community-initiated, community-led, community-based research. All of these are important steps as part of participatory research. We need to encourage mentor and mentee researchers and pay for elders and partnerships to happen. And look out there for the available resources. Please don't reinvent the wheel. Many of us have been doing this for a long time. Use the information that's out there for you. Next slide. So I'm going to just end with a couple of examples of where researchers and other people can go to look at samples of research ethics, guidelines for cultural knowledge. And these are just a few of the things that are open and available to you. In our website, nativescience.org, you can find our code of research ethics and principles. All of this is listed online. Next slide. And finally, this is another one that I'd worked on with a number of other Indigenous scientists from across the US. There are guidelines for considering traditional knowledge in climate change initiatives from this link on the website. Again, please find out what's available. If you don't know where it is, ask some of us. We've got reams and reams of information that's readily available to you. So I want to thank you all for listening for the few minutes that I have. I'm going to turn this back over to Anouk.
Thank you so much for sharing with us, Patricia. I've been learning from you for many years now, but I always learn something new every time that you get to share with us. So I'm going to turn it over to our next presenter. Dr. Sarah Ahrens is also Inupiaq. She's an earth scientist and assistant professor at Scripps Institution of Oceanography at the University of California, San Diego. And Dr. Ahrens will share a little bit more about herself and her work before she jumps into her presentation. Koyana.
Okay, thank you for the really nice introduction. Thank you everyone for your patience today. So my name is Sarah Ahrens. I'm an earth scientist and professor at Scripps Institution of Oceanography. I was born in Dillingham, Alaska and raised in Anchorage, Alaska. I'm of mixed ancestry, so I'm Inupiaq and white. My mother is from Unalakleet and my dad is from Los Angeles. My mother was Martha Anagic Ahrens, my father is Charles Ahrens, and my maternal grandparents were Lowell Anagic and Betty Nanauk Anagic from Unalakleet. I'm naming my relatives and my geographic ties to Alaska to provide some context for what I'll present and my participation in this panel. Today, I'm going to be primarily speaking about engaging with and collaborating with Indigenous researchers, both within academia and among communities. So we're all familiar with the demographics, or maybe we're not, regarding the representation of historically excluded groups in the geosciences. Since the early 1970s, we've been actively working to broaden participation in the geosciences. Yet between the years of 1973 and 2016, only 20 Native American women earned a PhD in the geosciences. As outlined in the Nature article, Native Americans hold full professorships in only 6 of 15 STEM fields in the nation's top 50 departments. So this isn't a pipeline issue. It's really a reflection of a multitude of issues that don't make the geosciences a very welcoming place for Indigenous people. Colonization, forced assimilation, and relationships that are overwhelmingly one-sided are sources of mistrust. In the words of Maori scholar Linda Smith, the ways in which scientific research is implicated in the worst excesses of colonialism remains a powerful remembered history for many of the world's colonized people. The lack of representation is a serious problem because who is better suited to ask questions and design research that's really relevant for their communities than those who have the lived experience? Erasure is an issue that Indigenous people grapple with daily. It happens in all arenas, in journalism, within funding agencies, and within academia. We're not extinct, we exist, and we are persevering. In this slide, I'm showing a screenshot of a Twitter exchange in which a person commented on the recent opening of the Northwest Passage in the Arctic due to diminishing sea ice as a result of climate change. The Arctic has now opened for business year-round, the result of climate change. This moment, so consequential you can't get your head around it, launches a geopolitical struggle for ownership of a place, sea routes, and ocean resources that were all once uninhabitable. In less than 280 characters, this person has completely erased the presence of all Arctic Indigenous peoples who have been surviving, adapting, and thriving in the harsh environment of the Arctic since time immemorial. In a figure in the right-hand corner of this slide, I'm showing the funding rate of competitively reviewed articles split up by PA race and ethnicity at the National Science Foundation. Native American and Alaska Native people are missing from this figure and instead are lumped in as multiracial. One may point out that there just simply isn't enough data there to be statistically significant, but does this mean that we should completely exclude them from this figure? One theme that's evident in the literature and also in my conversations with other Indigenous geoscientists is that our presence at institutions is a testament to our resilience and our resistance of the status quo. This article was published recently, and it kind of shares the experiences of 4 Indigenous scientists interviewed for this Nature article. I've summarized some key takeaways from it and from my conversations with other Indigenous scientists as well. So when approaching your Indigenous colleagues, there are several key points to remember. Native people are not monolithic, so we all have different lived experiences, cultures, backgrounds, and environments. When we speak of our experiences and the knowledges that we have accumulated throughout our lifetimes, this is not necessarily representative of all Indigenous peoples or groups. When you're recruiting and retaining Indigenous scientists to your institutions, it's essential to adequately support them by providing appropriate startup space or startup, lab space, and salaries. Are you really setting someone up for success when you offer a fraction of a startup compared to a non-Indigenous colleague? Are you providing the lab space that they need in order to conduct the work and the research that they were hired to do, and that matters for them and their communities? And what message are we sending regarding our value of Indigenous science and perspectives when we offer significantly lower salaries than startups? The impetus to drive more societally relevant research for the Arctic and a renewed interest in topics such as environmental racism has resulted in many more geoscientists developing and conducting research among Indigenous communities. I've listed some key questions to ask yourself when starting this process, including who is your work uplifting and centering? And who will this relationship benefit? What is the power dynamic in this relationship? As Patricia noted, Indigenous knowledge can be delegitimized as anecdotal or unsubstantial in meetings or conferences that are designed for Western science audiences. Some recommendations for addressing this issue include increasing the negotiation power of Indigenous people, and employing Indigenous people as experts in working groups, and soliciting the voice of Indigenous people. When you are engaging with and taking up time and benefiting from their knowledge, pay them for their time. Also remember that the question that you may be asking could have already been answered by the community. So do your homework before you enter into a community to make sure that that question hasn't already been researched and answered. When working with Indigenous people, the topic of data sovereignty must be discussed. In Patricia Cochran's guidelines for working with Indigenous communities, the data produced during knowledge co-production belongs to the communities, and work cannot be published or disseminated without prior approval. Indigenous communities should have the power to determine how and whether the data from the study is published. Understanding this is critical before starting a project. Working within Indigenous communities means including and incorporating Indigenous peoples and researchers in the research development process, not reaching out to them very close to the deadline as an afterthought. Many experiences illuminated by the nonprofit organization COERIC, who published an open letter in 2020, indicated that proposers were frequently contacting local organizations or community members within a few weeks of proposal deadlines, often with nearly a complete proposal and requesting essentially just a letter of support. The authors described a troublesome lack of involvement for local and Indigenous communities at all stages of the proposal process, and inadequate resources and opportunities for their participation as researchers and partners. A main takeaway point was that in overcoming mistrust, long-term relationship building is critical. Also thinking about capacity building. So if you're entering into community and doing research there and engaging in knowledge co-production, what kind of capacity building are you leaving behind? Many successful examples of bridging Western science and Indigenous knowledge exchange are those that are mutually beneficial. People are all driven by different goals and outcomes, and to prevent a relationship that is one-sided or extractive is essential to continue asking the question throughout the research process: is this work mutually beneficial? And finally, I would like to reiterate again that you should pay people for their time and offer to include Indigenous partners as co-authors on publications. If you're scheduling a conference, meeting, or a get-together, include funding for travel or per diem in your proposals. It's possible to also include honorariums as well. There are many guidelines, articles, and best practices that have been published regarding co-production of knowledge and best practices, including the one that Patricia Cochran mentioned earlier. I'm showing a graphic here on this slide produced by Carolina Behe of the Inuit Circumpolar Council, Rachel Daniel of Pew Charitable Trust, and Julie Raymond Yakubian of COERIC that illustrates how co-production of knowledge is best approached through a process of equity, trust, and relationship building. Before entering or approaching communities to begin the research process, it's essential to understand as much as possible about the Indigenous perspectives and the history of colonization that occurred there, along with its lingering impacts. It's not the responsibility of the Indigenous people or the community to educate you about this history, and in many cases, it can be emotionally draining. Talk to and form meaningful relationships with communities. Don't reach out 2 weeks before proposal deadline, and give as much advance notice as possible when you're seeking to establish collaborations. If you don't hear back after reaching out, you should respect their time and bandwidth. More questions to ask yourself when embarking on research projects that occur in Indigenous communities or impact Indigenous people. Do you have the permission to conduct this research? What is the intention with the data? And has this been discussed yet? Are you adequately valuing and compensating the time of participants who are aiding in this research? So I'm highlighting the work of Dr. Dominique David Chavez on this slide. Her article, A Global Assessment of Indigenous Community Engagement in Climate Research, really classified and broke down Western scientific participation and level of community participation within Indigenous communities with respect to climate research. So it's really broken down in terms of contractual, where community members are engaged to perform tasks and researchers are making all the decisions, all the way towards Indigenous, where the research process itself is really centered in Indigenous value systems. There's a historical context to the work that's being done, and community members really have authority of the research process. She examined a range of climate studies that included Indigenous community engagement in some capacity and found that nearly 90% of these studies utilize an extractive model where Indigenous knowledge was used with little participation or no decision-making authority from knowledge holders. As Patricia mentioned, there's no need to necessarily reinvent the wheel when you're looking to support existing efforts or broaden participation in the geosciences or within STEM. So there's many existing efforts and organizations that work to broaden the participation of Alaska Native and Native American people in the STEM fields. I've highlighted a few of them here, including the Alaska Native Science and Engineering Program, the American Indian Science and Engineering Society, and SACNIS. In academia, it's important for us to think about offering incentives for faculty to integrate aspects of society, race, and racism and its relationship to the geosciences in their curriculum, as these topics directly address issues that are relevant to Indigenous communities and may impact the direction that the geosciences take in the future. Right? And so I've heard a lot more recently about people thinking about including aspects of relationship building and community engagement in the tenure and review process. And I do think that this is a step in the right direction. As a final slide, I'm summarizing some more of the main points from the paper published by Dr. David Chavez that were also echoed within the Nature article that I showed before. So thinking about some indicators for responsible research practice within Indigenous communities. So the first point is access. So are the findings accessible to Indigenous community members? Can the data produced be easily accessed? What's the point of producing this data if it's not going to be available for the people who it affects the most? Another question is relevance. Are the findings reported in the context of concerns, issues, or interests defined by Indigenous community members? So is the work really going to be beneficial for the community itself? Credit. How were Indigenous community members credited for their knowledge, contributions, and efforts? So are they included in the acknowledgements? Are they provided co-authorship or sole authorship, for example? So thinking about data sovereignty is very important. Ethics. Did the study or the work or the project itself follow ethical guidelines, such as free, prior, and informed consent? Cause no harm. Did the study address intellectual property rights or risks for Indigenous peoples and communities? And outputs. Did the study report any outputs or outcomes for the Indigenous community? So Indigenous knowledge often incorporates lived experiences, which are ongoing, constantly changing, and cannot be summarized by one single person. After forming relationships, keep nurturing them and follow up with them and ensure that the knowledge produced is communicated and will benefit the communities that you're engaging with. Thank you for your time.
Queen of Book, Sarah. I will go right ahead and introduce our next presenter. Eva Dawn Burke is a Danaka and Lower Tanana Dene Athabascan MIT Solve Indigenous Communities Fellow and MS student in Natural Resources and Environment at the University of Alaska. I will hand it over to Eva and she can share a little bit more about herself. Queen of Book.
Hey, Duenda, Eva Dawn Burks, Ruza, Tagatili, Manly Hot Springs, Katana, Eslana, Ina Joy Burke, Ruza, Ta'a Dim Burke, Ruza, Setsu Lina Olin Didio, Setsia Billy Burke Didio. Hello, I'm Eva Burke. I'm from Nenana and Manly Hot Springs. My parents are Dim and Joy Burke, and my grandparents are Lina Olin and Billy Burke. And I'm calling in today from my ancestral lands of the Lower Tanana Dene here in Fairbanks, Alaska. And I am working on many things in my community, but I really wanted to focus today. Food sovereignty is one of the things that I really am passionate about. And I think that is, I don't know how to change that. There we go. So when I was asked to do this presentation, I was thinking of how does my work fit into decolonizing research? And I think of Indigenous knowledge is that it's its own knowledge system, and that our ancestors have been here on these lands for many generations. So it's one thing to study climate change from a bird's eye view, but it's another to come in and actually live in the system that's changing. And in this picture, these are my grandmothers, Lina Olin and Eva Roberts. And at this time in Alaska on the Yukon River, there were 8 pulses of salmon, which we no longer see today. We barely can even fish. I grew up commercial fishing. We lived a nomadic lifestyle. And so when we think about climate change and the infrastructure and the communities that we were really forced to choose, that really is not how we lived our lives. I grew up going between a trapping cabin and a fish camp, and we earned a living trapping and fishing from the river. And now you can't even barely fish for subsistence. So as a river that could support us economically, we can't even sustain ourselves from it to gather enough food for the year. So when we look at climate change and what's going on in Alaska, like I said, it's one thing to create these graphs and look at them, but it's another to actually live in these areas. And I think one of the biggest things that climate change does is not only affect the built infrastructure, but it affects people's ability to survive from the land. And it affects people's ability to focus on things like revitalizing language. And so there are some things on this graph with the heat, early river breakups making ice travel dangerous, sea ice retreat, we've seen that become problematic. But there also is another option for some of us, especially in the interior of Alaska, is that we're actually thinking about agriculture to adapt. We were just on a phone call with the Fish Commission, the Yukon River Intertribal Fish Commission, in which we had to have real conversations around how are we going to provide our communities with enough food for the winter because we can't harvest enough salmon. And so one thing that we've been talking a lot about is agriculture and adaptation. So as researchers, and we're thinking about how do we help communities? Are we just studying to study? Are we just creating literature? Because when I go to the village and I talk with my elders and the traditional knowledge holders, literature is not what they need. They need stories and presentations. They need data in a format that they can use. And so when I'm doing this work, I think, why am I doing this work? Food security is a real issue in Alaska. And so I am engaging in this work of food security and food sovereignty because it's something that my communities have asked me to do. And as we can see, because of climate change and things like commercial fishing, the ocean is changing, and the ocean not only affects species like whales, it also affects salmon, which go out to the ocean to rear. And as I was beginning my work at school in 2019, we had one of the lowest lows on the river, very high temperatures, and we saw salmon dying off in our rivers. And then in 2020, we had like this other extreme event where we had the highest levels of water that we had seen in years. And so as we're looking at things like agriculture, we have to build out agriculture in such a way that it can adapt to these low levels of water, but also to things that we're seeing, such as high afternoon thunderstorms with like flash flooding, basically just ripping off the topsoil. So we're looking at things like high tunnels to protect some of our crops and maybe even some greenhouses. So when I was doing this work, I showed you the picture earlier of my grandmother's fishing. And this work is important to me because as I was trying to revitalize my own family traditions, I started to realize the things that were in place and started to see the impacts of climate change firsthand. My grandmothers were able to produce a lot of fish, and here I was barely catching fish. So even though I'm trying to revitalize the local food systems, I realize there's this element of research and advocacy needed to protect our traditional foods, and advocacy not just in our, like advocacy in several arenas within the academic institution, advocacy within our communities, but then we also have to literally advocate in the game management structures like the Alaska Department of Fish and Game and the federal the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Federal Subsistence Board. So it's really hard for me because, you know, we have generations of knowledge. And so we've seen these changes over the years. And I think a lot of the scientific reports that I read, it's almost like I'm reading something that I already knew. And this is kind of a snapshot of the history of salmon before. You know, as I showed you in the previous picture, I was barely able to catch salmon, but I grew up during this time in the 80s where we had abundance of salmon. If you look in the 1975, the size of the salmon, this woman right here is probably about 5 inches taller than myself. So she's about 5'7". And if you look at the size of that king salmon, you know, you could see that we had larger salmon and we had more abundance of salmon. And from our stories, we know that we had 8 pulses of salmon. And the picture of my grandmother's was in 1945, that very first picture. So that's before Alaska was even a state. And so when I look at this graph and I think about the planning and co-management, one of the topics of this session was about self-determination. And so there we go. When I look at this slide, I think how much money and time and who is paid to create these graphs and come up with this data? Because we could have literally told you about this through a story, through our traditional knowledge, through our local observations. And so research in a way is we need to advocate to change the systems that are managing our food resources. And so research is just a small part of that. And really the systemic issues that exist are equity, justice, and decolonization. When I got into my work, it was about food and health justice. As Indigenous people living in relationship to the land, you can say that we have some of the highest rates of health disparities, such as obesity, diabetes, heart disease, also mental health issues and substance abuse disorders. And why is that? That's because of a break in our connection to the land. And because our food systems have been colonized, we're now putting foods in our bodies that our bodies were not meant to have, and they're now making us unhealthy. And there is an economic component to that. You know, we have to pay for healthcare in order to fix the problems that the foods are causing. And so that's why I started to get into this work and realized that, you know, scientific research plays a role in Indigenous food sovereignty and security. It's important. But more importantly is community engagement and advocacy, working with the people in the community to understand what they need, but also working within the scientific community to start breaking systems. If we keep doing the same thing, we're going to keep getting the same results. And as you've seen over the past 50 years of statehood in Alaska, you know, when I grew up in the 80s on the river, like I said, we were able to make a living fishing and selling fish. And now we'll be lucky to get a couple openings to where we can even gather maybe 20, 30 salmon to feed our families for the winter, and having to really think about adaptation. And so when forming scientific research partnerships, I hear often that, you know, they don't feel like advocacy is their role. But if you're creating data in partnership with the community and providing it in a format that they can use, such as, you know, one thing that we're doing is with the moose hunts, we realize that there's differences in between what the Board of Game is saying our moose population is and what we're actually seeing as locals. So now we're working with the university to say, how can we better count moose, and how can we use that data to go into the Board of Game system and create a regulation that is more reflective of what's actually going on, instead of this single species management. Because there's a real, you know, in the justice and decolonization, the problem really is economics and politics. And our food systems have been commercialized. And so as you look at this graph, what a sustainable harvest is not what we're seeing. What we're seeing is a forcing of nature. What we're seeing are hatchery fish to offset the need, you know, the amount of fish that needs to harvest to make a certain amount of money. So there's this incredible economic pressure. And of course, with economics, there's always politics. And I think I found this news article in February of just this year where one Alaska king salmon is worth the same as 2 barrels of oil right now. Alaska has the last wild king salmon run in the world. And so I would say that if we keep managing these systems the way that we have been, we'll be out of food in no time. And another example of the money that goes towards hunting our traditional foods, down in the Southwest, which is where Unit 17B is, the hunts are going for a brown bear, $24,500. For a moose hunt, $25,000 per person. And they were just, because of COVID, they said, the state of Alaska said, we lost out on a lot of our fees from, giving these out-of-state permits to non-resident hunters. And so now they're doing this big game raffle. So during COVID, we have communities that are literally going hungry, but the state of Alaska is more focused on the economic side of it and how to increase their income from our food resources, not how to feed us. And why does this matter? Because the value system that goes towards the animals. We live in relationship to the land, the plants, the animals, the waters, they're our relatives. And if you look at these pictures that are taken after certain hunts, the prize to them is the sheep horn curls, the size of the antlers. What you'll see is whole slabs of caribou wasted in the dump. In fact, my cousin just saw a whole caribou the other day at the dump. And so that's the problem with allowing the non-resident hunters, is it's not about food and it's not about protecting the natural resources. And in the face of climate change and the pressure from these hunters, you have this combined system that is leaving our people food insecure. So how can research help us to address some of these issues? And when we're talking about self-determination, we use this graph in our class to show where are we at on, where are Indigenous people realizing their right to be sovereign governments, to be sovereign nations, to manage their own natural resources, to manage the fish and wildlife within and around their communities? No, we're not. We're on this graph, we're only at advisory committees. We're not on management boards. There are no co-management agreements that exist. And so we are not even halfway towards Indigenous self-governance. And I don't have time to go into this slide in detail, but I just wanted to show where we're at on the scale. And it's really confusing in Alaska too, because we are having differences between the state and federal government. So you have, in Alaska, it's a very wide open area with a lot of wilderness. And so it's really hard to determine whether you're on state lands or federal lands. And that's important because there's two different sets of regulations for hunting and fishing based on whether you're on state lands or federal lands. And so that just adds to the complexity. And of recent years, we're seeing an actual kind of disagreement between these two systems where we feel like it's a state versus fed situation. And just during COVID, the community of Cake organized out of season hunt because they needed to provide meat to their community. So the federal government said, hey, you're within your right to go and harvest some animals and distribute that food within your community. Because during COVID, our grocery stores shelves were going empty in Alaska. We were food insecure. We still are food insecure. And there's also some issues with the ferry system going on that are making some of our villages in the Southeast have increased food insecurity problems. And so the state and the feds are now engaged in a court case over this very issue of what happened in Cake last summer. And I wanted to talk just a little bit more, I realize I'm about at time, that why is this important? It's important to people's health, all dimensions of their health, physical, spiritual, emotional, environmental, economics, all pieces of health. This is a quote from Charlie Wright. I'm a millionaire where I live because of the life I get to live. And so as a Native person, as an Indigenous person, being able to provide for your family, your community, to share that's the role you hope to achieve within your community. And this is millionaire status right here, having all of these different foods, the geese, the bear, the caribou meat, the beaver meat, and learning how to hunt and harvest is what makes our men healthy, and not even our men, our women as well. And I always talk about my son, Freddie, because we've also, being Indigenous people, we have a lot of intergenerational trauma. We are learning how to be cycle breakers. And my son has been through a lot. I am a single mother, and I've been able to teach him how to do these things here, fishing during all times of the year, how to harvest beaver. And this is what makes him well. This is what has changed his outlook on life. And this is his place that he goes to meditate. And I think this is what fuels my passion and passion around food security. Is it's not just about my son's well-being, but it's about my nephew's well-being, his cousins that I take with us, and all the other kids of the community that I'm working with. I'm now trying to host a fish camp, or I am hosting a fish camp in my village of Ninana this summer, where I'm going to teach the kids how to cut fish, how to smoke and jar strips. And because of our low salmon runs, I'm having to use my Indigenous, I call it my Indigenous food network, to procure other types of fish from other parts of the state, so that I have something to work with these kids this summer. And that's really hard, because I want to be able to throw a net out or a fish wheel in the community in Ninana and show the kids how to harvest right there, but that might not be a reality for us. And I just want to share a little video of some of what's important to me. Okay, I think I'll finish up there because I realized I went just a little bit over.
Great enough book, Eva. Really enjoyed your presentation, and also realized with our connection to MIT that I'm related to Eva through my husband, who's Athabascan, and I always like to bring up our relationships. So I'll be the next speaker, and I'll just go in and introduce myself. Wanga ano kigik dag mishunga igne book dath inubak sining nyak book. I'm Anoke, and my family is from Shishmaref, Alaska, which is the same region that Patricia and Sarah's family is also from. And I'm going to share my presentation, which is about decolonizing research. And we are approaching the end soon. So I just want to let people know we are running over time by 4:45 p.m. Eastern time. So I'll try to do this quickly. So when I think about engaging in research, what gets me excited is when the research process is centered in Indigenous value systems. And I will zero in on two Inupiaq values that really have shaped my life. I will talk about how our Indigenous languages carry our worldview and perspective, how strong Indigenous-led research is supportive of the strong interdependent relationships. And, you know, I get excited when Indigenous communities have authority over all aspects of the research. When there's material, cultural, and spiritual benefit to an Indigenous community. And really, whether or not the research supports systems change and policy change. We talked a lot about how colonization has shaped our lives as Indigenous people and as non-Indigenous people, and how it's really important that there's a meaningful result, a practical, tangible result of the research. So Eva mentioned that because of climate change, a lot of us are pulled away from a lot of the healing work that we're involved in. And over the last, I would say 10 years, I've dedicated my time to both climate justice and language revitalization efforts. And I'm going to share with you Inupiaq values and how thinking about these values gets communicated through our language, because I think it's really important to start from our languages, because that's where our worldviews and our perspectives are grounded. So an Inupiaq value, ilisaqturut alagur ningarun nunam sut alungakpat inunar viptirni nunakun sillakun daryukun damna kanurluru umiarutikput nunapterni dork darumi dork sillami dork aturniak bisiru sivun muktak sarluta inuneput. These are some of the questions that to me and to many Indigenous communities are very important when it comes to navigating climate impacts. How are we going to continue living our lives as Inupiaq people when our land and all of the natural processes are central to our identity? I also really like to normalize the speaking of our languages, and whenever I present, I make sure to practice my Inupiaq and make it a living and breathing language. This is actually a picture of my relatives in Shishmaref on a seal hunt. So the second Inupiaq value that really guides my life as an Inupiaq researcher is Inubiralanik, knowledge of language. Anik sutavat nunakilani inunawanipta. Irliktoat sivun muktaho tikshangani. Asisuli ataw chikakluta inulaluta angayukarirluta nunakikatiruvlu. Asisuli alat savaravit taputilurit kanoksoangak darniak bisigu demunga kinguvanak shraptirnun duktit charlure. And I want to talk about a discovery that I made about the Inupiaq language that is actually a commonality in other Indigenous languages. This is actually my son and one of my my husband's relatives. And the word amau in Inupiaq is actually the same for addressing your great-grandchild or your grandparent in Inupiaq. And I write Inupiaq curriculum, and I was just really fascinated by this concept of how much our language and our kinship terms show us about our values and how we connect with one another. And this practice of of using a Mao for these these kinship terms is representing the rebirth of succeeding generations and the link that binds them together. And so a lot of our decision making in Indigenous communities is related to preserving our lifestyle across generations. And I've been really enjoying reading a lot of work by Leanne Simpson. And in her book, she also talks about Kobade and Nishnabeg, which also is used to refer to great-grandparents and great-grandchildren. And she describes it as a link in a chain that connects generations between nations, states of being, between individuals. And, you know, Kobade is just one part of a larger cycle. And, you know, she really emphasizes how in our kinship and the way we organized ourselves and our governance systems, there was an absence of coercion, hierarchy, and authoritarian power. I also just want to share like how much precision and just brilliance in the terms that we use to describe our environment. So sikukun tagesit, these are ice terms. And, you know, English just doesn't capture a lot of these terms. And I really believe like the answer to a lot of our climate solutions is embedded in our languages. I want to talk a little bit about the work that Robin Bronin, who will speak after me, and also Patricia Cochran has really helped, has really been involved with before I started graduate school. And we worked with 15 Alaska Native communities. This is a picture at one of our annual meetings. And I'll describe like a little bit how Indigenous informed research. I'll just provide an example of what that looks like. So as the director of the program, a lot of how we ran the program was informed by our elder, Patricia, and myself. And we also facilitated biweekly teleconferences where community members would share environmental observations. We visited the communities and held gatherings or meetings where all the tribal and non-tribal governing bodies were invited. And when we had our annual gatherings, the agenda was planned by the tribal representatives based on what was important to them. We worked with communities to do community-based monitoring where we use both Indigenous knowledge and Western science to inform our work. We compensated and acknowledged the Indigenous knowledge holders that we worked with. And the research that we did was used to inform policy, systems change, and decisions to support tribal self-governance and climate adaptation. Here's a picture of the villages that we worked with and a map of Alaska. I really like the slide that Dr. Aaron shared about collaborative research. So I would categorize like our work as collaborative research with room to grow towards Indigenous-led research. And so just to give you a snapshot of one of the things that we worked on, we worked with Yupik linguists to create a term called ushtuk, which describes land collapse. And it's the interaction of 3 different natural hazards: flooding, thawing permafrost, and erosion. And right now, erosion isn't considered a natural hazard under the Stafford Act that that can trigger like funding or like a mechanism from like FEMA or programs through the federal government that work on emergency preparedness. And so we believe that by using Indigenous terms, we can help create policy change. And currently, Ushtek is now recognized under the Alaska State Hazard Mitigation Plan, and we're continuing to work with tribes to document more information so that this could be included under FEMA. So this is just an example of like how using language and like Indigenous knowledge can translate into policy change. And I wanted to leave you all with a few questions. So as you work with Indigenous communities, you know, acknowledging that colonization and capitalism are the reasons for the climatic and environmental destruction that we are experiencing today, and it's only accelerating. Indigenous peoples have the solutions. So how are you centering Indigenous voices and encouraging Indigenous leadership? How do you use your privilege and to challenge oppressive states and policies? Are you aware of the history and contemporary acts of colonization where you live? How are you actively and regularly assessing your role as a settler and or within a colonized system? How are you aware and supportive of Indigenous knowledges, languages, worldviews, and relationships? Or the opposite, are you challenging Indigenous knowledges, languages, worldviews, and relationships? So I just want to leave some of those questions, and I really want folks to like really like marinate in them, think about them, and keep them at the forefront as you engage with Indigenous peoples. And since we are running out of time, I want to introduce the next speaker, Robin Bronin. She's my former coworker and a dear friend of mine who is the co-founder of and the executive director of the Alaska Institute for Justice. And I'm going to hand it over to Robin. Thank you.
Thank you, Anouk, and thanks everybody. And I'm just going to take a couple of minutes because we are over time and because we started late. The session is going to end at, if you're on the East Coast, at 4:45. And so the only thing that I would like to add, and thank you everyone, Dr. Ahrens, Eva, Patricia Cochran, and Anouk for your powerful presentations, is how research informs policies. And in the context of the climate crisis and climate forced displacement, and particularly the internal movement of people, meaning people staying within their countries or states, there are huge policy gaps right now. The US government has a horrific legacy of forcibly relocating people within the United States, and this legacy cannot continue. And then the World Bank. The World Bank has an involuntary resettlement guidebook that has been guiding national governments on forcibly resettling people in order to build development projects. And what we know from all of these government mandated relocations is that people have been seriously harmed. And so we really, as researchers and academics, must think hard about how it is we are conducting the research that will inform policy, because it's an open book. We do not know how to resettle or relocate people within a country, specifically because of environmental change, and make sure that their human rights are protected. And the human right to self-determination is the most important human right to protect in this context, so that the people who are being have to leave their homes and the places they love are guiding the research, the policies that are created, and making the really difficult decision to determine whether or not they can stay in their homes. I'm going to end it there. And there was one question. So if Sarah, I know Anouk had to leave, but if Sarah, Eva, and Patricia could go back online. There was one question about the IRB process, and the person asking the question was saying that at her university, there's an IRB process that makes sure that Indigenous peoples would be communicated or consulted with way before a funding proposal is submitted. Can any of you respond to that question about the IRB process and whether that protects the issues that you were talking about?
I can take a stab at answering that question. So for knowledge co-production research, especially related to climate or Earth surface processes, there is no IRB approval required. So if you are working on a research question directly related to Indigenous people, including like, for example, like how climate change is impacting health, and that research involves either medical data of Indigenous people or in-depth interviews with Indigenous people and communities, then that definitely does require IRB approval. But if you're working on a project or meeting with people, trying to co-design a research topic that's related to science and climate change in a particular community, then it doesn't necessarily require the IRB approval. So there is a lot of research. IRB approval is designed to basically protect or make sure that everything's done in a really ethically responsible way. And because there's no IRB approval necessarily required for knowledge co-production in the geosciences especially, this kind of means that sometimes relationships may not be necessarily two-sided, if that makes sense. And then, Eva shared an example of IRB protocols from her university in the chat. I don't know if everyone can see that.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to add to what Dr. Ahrens just shared? So another question was, do any of you have advice for grant funders to better encourage researchers to prioritize Indigenous values?
I dropped something in the chat earlier, and then Dr. Sarah mentioned it as well, was the Navigating the New Arctic letter, where 200 researchers signed the letter requiring more Indigenous input into the National Arctic Science Initiative. And also, I just did this too. I'm working on a grant with NSF where we're writing back to NSF to say, hey, we need to have more budget for relationship building, because what it turns out is, like, when we're trying to develop our research, we're on these different schedules. And so we are asking for more time and more budget to develop relationships.
And I can only say that from my many years of experience, this is probably one of the key questions that we always have had, is adequate funding and acknowledgement of the importance and the necessity for the kind of information that comes from our communities. For years and years, it's been a discussion that I've had going on with all of the funding agencies that we work with. I'm hoping at some point it will be resolved. I'm just not sure where that point comes in. But I think the funding agencies need to start looking at things from a kind of a different perspective, and understanding that It costs, just as it costs researchers to go out and do research in marine science and in vessels and in travel to all of the places that they go to. It's the same kind of cost that we have within our communities as well. And that kind of research, that kind of information that comes from communities is just as important, because it gives a different flavor, a different perspective, a different way of looking at things. And that's what science is all about, is really looking at things from all angles. So you're just building a better basis for science if you expand the fields of knowledge and information.
Thank you. There is another question about if there has ever been a forced relocation that was just and fair. And not that I know of. And I'll just mention that in Alaska, the forced relocation of the Unungan people from the Aleutian Islands during World War II caused 10% of the population to die. And so it is a horrific example of forcible relocation that is not in our distant past. And I think that that's what is important to remember about this. Forcible relocations are happening now. For a variety of reasons, and that cannot be the future that we create because of the climate crisis. There was another question about for the Ile de Jean Charles resettlement. They were told the UN declaration did not apply, and I'm not sure if that was the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples or the Human Rights Declaration, but does anybody want to answer that question? What I can just share is that the US government has a horrific legacy of protecting the human rights of people within the country and also people outside of the country, and that it is our work as a human rights attorney to make sure that we are constantly advocating for human rights, be persistent and persevere, because it is what must happen in having human rights and tribal sovereignty be the focus and central point of how we look at this issue of climate forced displacement. I'm looking to see, so I think we're almost at time. Are there any other thoughts or comments from Dr. Ahrens, Eva Burke, or Patricia Cochran before we close?
I just want to say how grateful I am especially to all of the amazing young people who are working in science and research now. It does my heart so much good to see Sarah and Eva and Anouk, all of you. So I send you many, many blessings and tons of love.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation. And it was really great to listen to all the presentations today.
Hayana, everyone. Thank you so much.